Hello, everybody. This is Hippie Hacker with II, and we are starting the conformance meeting for August the 25th in most places. I will be your host today, and I see we have friends from all over the world, so welcome, welcome, welcome. Remember to abide by the CNCF Code of Conduct and the Kubernetes Code of Conduct as well. We have an attendee area. Please add yourself there, and an open discussion. Last moments to add a few things to the bottom if you want. Otherwise, we can go into our time of open discussion. All right. I am HH. I've got a few issues up here. Rion's got a few. John's got an issue at the end. And if we have time, just go ahead and add your more issues to the bottom. This first issue is one that we've had open for a while. It is identifying features and API operations as optional. We specifically are looking for a create core v1 namespace service account token that is in core, but we need to kind of separately decide if we want to remove that from conformance because it's currently still part of our surface area. But in trying to understand other endpoints as well, knowing if there is a way to tie specific API operations and kinds that are part of feature gates, because obviously to be part of conformance, it's not something that we should be able to feature gate on and off. The manual process right now is inspecting the Kubernetes code at rest, which is looking at the comments actually in the Kubernetes source code, which gets interpolated into the Open API. It doesn't make it all the way into the Open API spec, I don't think. Other operations and endpoints are usable in this case only if we have a metric server, which it's unclear how we're supposed to install that. So we were putting forth that to SIG Arch a while back. And the note is that if a feature gate goes to DG gate and defaults to true, and you can turn it off, does it still expect to be conformant? We had some conversation points a while back, and I think it came down to that was our last point. It's going to be done eventually, but not in a time frame useful to us back in October. And then at the beginning of this year, John removed the lifecycle stale. I saw it go stale again and he removed it. And I was asking about any time plan or frames on this. I just want to make sure before I stir this up too much that this is something that we do want to resurrect and keep on the as a higher visibility, or whether we should go ahead and let it rot.
I mean, we can't. We can bring it up again, but you know, if SIG API machinery has too many other balls in the air, that doesn't mean they're going to get to it anytime sooner. But you know, certainly that's the way you make things happen: make them more visible. Okay. So, you know, I guess the question is, do we have? Is it blocking us in anything right now? Is it blocking, say, automated checks? Is that what the issue is? Or, you know, that kind of information would be helpful to them to know.
Yeah, I think for us, it's knowing whether we should be targeting an endpoint or not and trying to get authoritative. In this case, for this particular endpoint, I think there's a separate issue on should we have create core v1 namespace service account token be part of the surface area that we want to cover for conformance.
Right.
Go ahead.
Oh, I haven't looked at that issue at all, so I'm not. I don't know. I don't know the context there, I guess. So.
We have a. Go ahead.
Go, talk.
Our mandate is to not include in conformance API operations that are optional.
Right.
And for create core v1 namespace service account token, it's still unclear to me if this should be removed.
And why do you say it's optional?
I think when we looked at the core of it, is it tied? We're trying to find a way, is it tied to a feature flag or not? And then the conversation kind of went, well, you should be able to figure that out at runtime, but we're trying to figure it out as policy, right? If we look at the, for these particular fields, I think, and this we're talking about security context, the operation is service account token.
Mm-hmm.
And in our area here, I think we don't have all of these available. This was some older work we did to try to figure out which fields were gated or not.
I mean, typically, right, feature gates are eliminated when something goes GA.
So is this controlling the presence of a field or the presence of an endpoint?
The endpoint's there, as far as, maybe that was it. I think, Aaron, I think it controls the presence of the operation or the endpoint.
So the security context, like, there are lots of fields that appear and disappear based upon a feature gate, but those don't map to endpoints because our endpoints are very, a very rough granularity.
Yeah.
I mean, you can turn off APIs too, of course. So even if it's something is, quote, required, I believe you can just turn off the API anyway. But so it's really a policy. It's not a technical designation, required or optional. It's really a policy of what we consider to be part of core Kubernetes, aka conformance. Like, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe we can turn off all the APIs if we want. Right? Your API enablement and your API server is flexible enough to do that.
I think our policy should probably be what is default if you don't change the feature sets for our, and like don't intentionally disable things, particularly stuff in core. And I think that create core v1 namespace service account token in this case is enabled by default and wouldn't have a flag to turn it on.
Yeah, it's just by API group. So if it's just in the group, it's going to be either on or off.
Yeah,
you can turn the whole group on or turn the whole group off. So, but you started dividing things up into more groups.
So
anyway.
I mean, this sounds like it's in the nice to have bucket. I do think it's worth asking again to see, because it's been about a year since you last asked. It would be worth seeing where that falls these days. But I think of it in terms of how, like, you can use, is a field deprecated or not, to sort of automatically generate exclusions of certain endpoints or fields. It would be useful, you probably have this, like, to have an ongoing, a document that sort of represents current plan of record as far as why certain endpoints or fields are excluded.
It's right here. This is the of record.
Right. And so the thought being that for some of the things that are you know, blocked by a feature gate or something, you could put some kind of reminder there, such that, you know, sort of each release we could sort of periodically revisit, like, hey, has this particular feature gone GA, or has this feature gate been removed, or is there like a KEP that we can link to, or something to remind us that like this needs to be revisited. That feels like that, because you're kind of having to do the groundwork of like talking to humans and understanding what's going on. It's about annotating it in a way that you can revisit those decisions as the project evolves and grows more stable.
Annotating it within the API Snoop repo for our decision to exclude it is where we're doing it now. And the reason is usually in the link here. And this is, I don't know if Zach's on the call, but we have,
yeah,
he's not here today, but
so you're annotating endpoints here.
Yeah.
Right. I feel like the issue you're linking is about fields. Maybe I'm wrong.
The issue that we're linking to around here is around fields.
Oh,
let me
okay.
go back.
You're saying API operations as well. Okay.
Yeah, feature flags that enable and disable operations. And it may have been that at, again, it's digging back a year or more, but the for create service account token, it may be that a required parameter within it was a field that is disabled or could be optional.
So I'm just suggesting, it sounds like you maybe did some archaeology on this a year ago, but we didn't drop down something that said what the decision was and why it was made that way at the time. It would be useful to, if we can't get this annotated in the API itself, because that remains, you know, not a priority and not something you have the resources to address yourself, then finding a way to annotate it with like actionable issues that can be revisited sounds like the appropriate compromise here.
Our research prior was fields. Like these are the fields that were required, deprecated, or there's the feature. So I have to go back through. Okay, let's revisit that and do some current research on tying together when we hit those and where to annotate the optional, because of a feature flag making it optional. Is that what you're saying, Aaron?
Yes.
All right. Thank you for capturing that, Rian. I think that's, is there anything else on that particular issue? I will go ahead and open the next meta issue. This one is our log for detecting flaky test root cause. Stephen, are you on? This is, a lot of this is your work, but I can, yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the problem was that if you go to the power history, there is 3 flakes that Liggett had asked for a review of what was happening and trying to use the Prowl Jobs resources as a guide to actually create a separate cluster for going through a number of test runs. And when I did like a 50 consecutive test run, the slowest time for the whole test was only just under 6.8 seconds, and then 100 run. I wasn't seeing any outliers, but when I went through further down, when I looked through the appropriate logs, it looked like the pause container was having issues to start, and then that was causing a timeout, but there was just no way I could replicate the actual flake. I think if you scroll right to the right on that one there, yeah, so it's showing that the select file wasn't able to be found. So, and yet when I've run it multiple times, the test is behaving itself perfectly okay. So it's just trying to get a bit more guidance on whether or not that's stuff that's been covered in the SIG testing meeting this morning will give me some extra clues. But it's trying to do as much prep before doing stuff through a PR changes and then trying to rerun it. That was just causing some issues.
What's the context of these 50 runs and 100 runs logs?
What I did is, if you go to that link there.
Like you're running the same test over and over?
Yeah, so
That one
basically
test?
I've got a separate fork of the job, and if you scroll down a little bit further, Happy, there's some extra timing components that I put into this particular job so that I could see what the timing that was happening for each stage of the test, as well as what the rate was going through, to try and find any outliers. And across the 150 tests runs, basically there's no outliers at all that I'm seeing. And that's on a cluster that was only having 4 gigs of RAM. So it was under the spec resources that were for the Prowl job, from what I can understand.
Right. So I feel like one of the takeaways from the SIG testing session this morning might be that running the test in isolation is one thing, but the next step would be to figure out how to run the test alongside sort of other tests, or how to find some way to stimulate timings getting thrown off by concurrency. And it's maybe a little difficult here to verify whether it is the underlying container engine that's having timing difficulties, or if it's kubelet that's having timing difficulties, or what. But I feel like running the same singular test over and over isn't adequately, even if it's in like a resource constrained cluster, it's maybe not adequately simulating that cluster being under load and having tons of tests run in parallel.
I did try and run the stress test actually on the VM at the same time on some other options. And even when I was doing that, I didn't see any real outliers, but it was separate from, yeah, I understand the point of trying to run some extra load on the actual cluster itself to simulate other test runs. So
Yeah, I mean, that actually looks to me like that flake is probably due to an actual bug somewhere that's not in this test. That's something around the mounting of the image file system in the container. And that likely is some sort of race condition in the code that sets all that up. And that's why we saw it a few times under heavy load when lots and lots of things are happening. But if you're just repeating serially, or you're not exercising the same segment of code concurrently in a lot of different and crazy ways, you're not going to see it.
okay.
It's a true flake, but it's just and not even necessarily this code. I mean, that would be my first guess anyway.
Okay. Just going back to the Prowl history, Happy. Looking at the last 2 like green runs for the last set of commits, I noticed also that those timings for some of those jobs being run through, it lines up with a lot of the CI changes that like just the timing runs just drop drastically compared to the timing runs and the historical jobs. So I'll see if I can look over the video and from the meeting this morning and get a few more ideas before I send back some comments back to Liga, I think, at this stage.
I think that's fair. I think I agree with John. It could be that you're running into like an actual legitimate underlying bug, and so I think that would be worth pointing out. And I think, you know, throw a couple explicit testable Kubernetes kinds at it and see if it sort of continues to behave the same way, or if you're seeing flakes. And so maybe that lends some credence to your theory that it seems to be behaving better with explicit resources and reduced adjacent load.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks for the feedback.
Thanks also to the SIG testing and Liget's videos this morning. That was at 5 o'clock our local time, so we're going to review that later in the day whenever that gets uploaded.
I'm working on that now.
By the way, in probably 3 months, whenever everything switches over, it will actually be at 7 a.m. our local time, which we can probably attend whenever the flippy bits happen. Rian, do you want to go over this next one around the Git flow control API server API group?
That endpoint is one of the technical debts that came in, I think, in 117. And I looked around for information on that. And if I go into the specification, it says that the flow schema is actually an alpha endpoint. So it depends on an alpha feature, which also then would exclude it for conformance. So I just would like to get your feedback. What's your thoughts on that? Should it be excluded because it's got an alpha feature?
I guess I'm not clear. It's being counted right now as a missed test. Oh, well, yeah, if it depends on an alpha feature, then definitely it shouldn't be in the list of things.
We will submit another PR to API Snoop to update that list of endpoints to include that. I just wanted Rian to go through the full process of identifying it and bringing it towards the group.
Okay, yeah, for sure.
There's a learning process.
But I think, you know, just tying back to what we were talking about earlier, it would be great to have this link to an actual issue that represents the feature being in alpha status, so you can be sure to like track, hey, it's not an alpha anymore. We should do something.
So when we in this list here, do we want to, like, I think right now these link to specific commits or notes for things where it's an alpha feature. Do we want to link to an issue instead? Because these are just links that we have.
Yeah, link to the enhancements issue.
Okay.
Which is used to track it as it goes through stages. Now we are building, as part of the enhancements subproject, we're building tooling to try and deal with these things better. So, you know, if the volume is high enough, which I don't know that it is, in theory you can. Right now we've got tooling, or we have metadata in a file now that says what stage it's in and when it's graduating, expected to graduate, like to the next stage and that sort of thing. So we could actually have a job that runs through and says, find everything that says it's GA. And I mean, you already have this job, right? I mean, you're talking about having this job, but you might be able to put some tooling around this is all I'm saying. But it depends on how much volume it is, whether it's worth it.
We should create a different issue just to do a quick query to see if we can quickly see the dependence of the missing endpoints to see if they depend on alpha parameters or kinds, like if the API that is in core GA, if it calls kinds that are not in core.
So that's the confusion. Okay. So we don't, you can add alpha fields and alpha kinds to a GA group, right?
But if they're required parameters for a GA endpoint, then they cannot be conformance because you can't use un-GA kinds if it's
Correct.
required, right? And that's what we're.
It's
this
only
one,
required if the feature gate is on, right? And we typically don't do that where we would add a required field, because if we do that, it can cause problems with upgrade downgrade cycles and things like that. Typically, they don't get added as required unless it's like a new kind, right? You can have required fields in a new kind.
Yeah,
but
I think for API server API group, it's hard with the dogs.
You're
Can
gonna
you
have
mute
to
when
the dogs.
you're?
Sorry,
I can't handle
about that.
it. It's all good. Rian, can I get a confirmation that this is not Get API server API group? Like that doesn't look like that full, because there's the Get API group on core, and anytime there's a new API group, you can get the one underneath that. And that is available for any time there's a new API group. So whether they're in alpha or not, I think we're always going to get that API group in core, because that's where the dynamic API is exposed. Does that sound roughly correct?
It could be, if you want to double check on the actual endpoint, it's in API Snoop under the technical debt for 117.
Okay.
We want to quickly review.
Technical debt one. So check all the colors. 117, and it's this guy here. The little whoop, bloop. There we go. It is okay. That is the full group. I think there is always going to be a get something API server API group for any group that gets created. So anytime there's a new API group, as soon as it hits alpha, we will get a new core endpoint called get that new group API server API group. And just like John was saying, we just need to put that into the list of not yet and link to the issue for tracking that. So
yeah,
that
I'm
when
not
it hits,
familiar with that code particularly, but it would be nice if it didn't show up there unless you've got the feature gate enabled. So I'm a little surprised that it does show up there if the feature gate's not enabled.
well, realize that we don't have the ability to know which endpoint is feature gate enabled or not yet. And that's why we're seeing this. And that was part of the other ticket earlier.
Right, but the cluster, which cluster did you run? That this is in a CI cluster? Or this is in...
No, we don't use a cluster to define what's part of conformance. We use the source code.
Oh, okay. I thought you were seeing this showing up in your API Snoop. You've got your process that identifies the things that are being hit. Okay.
This is just, it is in the code. Somebody promoted it and it just automatically gets created. It's part of the process. And so when we have these, these two things were tied together for that reason. And so we know super clearly now why this one shouldn't be there. And we need to link it together. We have no way of automating this process because the metadata is not there within the Open API.
So you're looking at the Open API schema, which is the static one that's generated. Okay.
And the funny thing is that file is generated by quickly spinning up API server with default parameters, doing a query to that endpoint and dumping it to the repo. It's actually generated from a momentary instance of API server up and running.
Well, that's interesting though, because that may indicate a problem with the feature gate. I mean, you didn't get other ones showing up there, right? There are other new, I guess they're probably not new groups.
I'd have to go look at it, but it's if you look at the jobs or you look at any commit that updates the the Open API JSON file, there's actually code that the shell script spins up API server and then does a curl and redirects it to the JSON file.
And it spins it up with a runtime config equals all, or runtime config equals just the default?
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Oh, yeah,
I'm
cool.
updating
You
that.
don't? Come on. You should be
This was like
able
2 years ago.
to- okay.
I was
Yeah,
surprised because I
that
thought it
works.
was like some type of tooling that we use to generate the open API, and it's not. It is literally bringing up API server and querying it and saying, what's on the menu today? And then publishing that as our de facto interface, which is what we base our conformance tests on.
Okay, so let's do a little more research into that. And definitely, if this group is just an alpha group, then yeah, you should be able to look at the groups and see what kinds are available based upon, specifically for API groups, right? So if there's only an alpha available, V1 alpha 1 or V1 beta 1 or whatever it is, there's no V1 or V2 available, then it's
We won't know because that's a response, and we can't query the response while we're doing.
no, you can get that out of the Open API schema. So
Okay.
you can,
Well,
yeah, you can look at all the kinds, the groups and kinds that are available, and the version is in there. Well, group, version, and kind, right? You can get that, and if you see that
so
this
if we
this
have a
kind,
group that doesn't have any core endpoints, then for that particular core get something group, it's not part of conformance.
if it doesn't have a
GA.
non-alpha or beta, if
Yeah.
it doesn't have a GA version associated with it, then you can exclude it.
Okay, we will update our logic for.
Okay.
Well, yeah, we'll get into that. So that will clear up all the way back to 117. Yay! And then I think we're actually looking at these two endpoints for 116. And if we do these two, because like Discovery API group, hey, it's already tested. There's really only one other one, and that was the other one we were talking about, was create core V1 namespace service account token. If we can decide on this one, that means all the way back to when we started writing tests, we will have 0 technical debt since we started writing tests, or I started writing tests. So I would love to know, because we've got the other one figured out. This create core V1 namespace service account token. Can we write a test for it, or can we get rid of it? And that's
I think you can. Yeah. I don't know offhand. It sounds like something that is probably required. It probably should be tested, but I have to look in more detail.
We'll do a little more research on that. I feel the same way, John. It was just back when we were, I think this was, or like we were talking about, this is when we were looking to see around parameters.
Right. But most of the service account stuff is something that is required.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we can't do anything without service accounts.
Yeah.
These are the 3 topics that we had, and we have 2 more from John. So I'll hand the baton to you, John.
Sure. So I went through the recording from last meeting when I wasn't here, and everybody talked about the document I put together, which the main thing I got out of the recording was a topic I didn't put in the document and was orthogonal to it, which is the process of how we add new groups of tests or how we reduce technical debt by adding conformance tests for chunks of functionality or potentially possibly optional functionality, and how we validate that with vendors and give them time to adopt the functionality and make sure that they can pass it before we make it officially conformance. And that's great. And I can add that to the doc, but there was I kind of honestly got the feeling that nobody read the doc, because there was a discussion of that I was proposing something and this document doesn't propose anything. It raises a bunch of questions about the things that I've heard raised and concerns and decisions and things that we need to address before we can really make progress on the profiles. The thing I did propose was what generated the doc in the first place, which was those privileged and base. And I think that's maybe what people were talking about at the proposal. But the point of that really was to engender some discussion about, like, one of the things, I think, Aaron, you brought up that
that, sorry, this is actually, I've jumped to the second one. Sorry, but we can change the notes later. You brought up, like, you're coming from the user perspective, right? Brad's coming from the vendor perspective. And so those two different perspectives, I talk a little bit about in that document. And then there was a third perspective too, which you'd think I could just think of off the top of my head, but maybe it was the
like the workload perspective or something.
let me see.
I
So-
think you got the
the-
provider perspective, and then the people providing the solution vendors, like they're writing something they
Wow.
want to be able to run on the vendors.
There's actually, that's a fourth perspective, but it's kind of aligned with it. The first one was community and CNCF. The community wants to avoid fragmentation and wants to allow people to write tooling and applications against a consistent set of APIs. So that kind of is covered in there, right? That's also the tool vendors. So then there's the users who want to know that stuff can run, right? They want to know that stuff can run. And then there's the vendors who generally share in those goals, but also have this sort of commercial marketing need to get this badge, right? So we don't need to take notes on all this because it's already in the document. But the point is, like, I really want us as a group to go through this and discuss some of these things. So maybe what I need to do is shoot out a note and ask people to take a look at it, because we need to decide that what happens is, or what I believe is happening is, we're picking one of these views, or different people are arguing from a different viewpoint, and it changes the purpose and reason for the profile, which then has the effect of changing how we would define those profiles. And so I think that's part of the reason we keep going in loops, is that all of these are valid perspectives and everybody has good arguments. And so we're coming up with different options that satisfy different subsets of those stakeholders, but nothing that really works for everybody. And so I think we have to, as a group, decide which of these is actually, who are we trying to solve for, or is there a way to solve for everybody?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement of the problem. Yeah, I apologize if I didn't accurately guide.
No, you were fine, Aaron. You were fine.
Because yeah, it seemed like a lot more of the discussion was not necessarily grounded in the doc. But I think that's a good framing of the problem. Like, is it possible for us to meet the needs of all stakeholders? And if not, can we agree on a common set of priorities for these stakeholders, given that we're all coming from different positions here?
Yes. So I guess I'll send out a note and we'll just try to hopefully get people to take another look at the document and revisit this in the next meeting. So then the other topic I wanted to talk about was something else that Tippy, you mentioned in the meeting, which I actually thought was an awesome idea, and it just sort of like went by with passing and people nodding their heads, but I think we actually need to do something about it. This was my other topic. So, and that is, you mentioned, hey, I think somebody asked about the vendors, I don't remember who it was, and said, hey, what about those tool vendors or those people, I think it was Walter, like, what about the people delivering these workloads? And they have this vested interest of, you know, they want their workload to work on all the different Kubernetes providers, and how can they validate that? And Hippie, you mentioned that API Snoop, set up with the proper audit configuration, can identify all the endpoints that are hit by a given workload. And I thought that's really nice and could help us get some of these vendors to potentially contribute if we can package that up in a really simple, easy to use way. And we can go to, I don't know, Redis and say, hey, you've got your packaged solution for your product. If you just push these two buttons here, spin up a cluster with this configuration, whatever, it does everything for you, ideally. And it'll spit out a report for you of, here are the APIs that you're using that are not currently part of conformance. And you can help out by going to the conformance meeting and talking about these and identifying which ones should be part of conformance, working with the team there and writing some tests, right? So like, I think that's actually because we're aligning with their interests, we could actually pull people in, but we have to make it easy for them because the process for right now is non-trivial, right? It's not you have to get steeped in the conformance world to be able to do it, and that's going to be too high of a bar.
My understanding is that the enhancement that would make this significantly easier is dynamic audit webhook configuration.
We just killed it.
Yeah, we just killed that. So
which has just been killed because there was a decision that actually is far more fundamentally complex when you dig into it. And so the only other drop-in thing that's available is admission webhooks, I think, which don't necessarily expose the same level of granularity that API Snoop requires.
So we don't need a drop-in on the cluster. We just need a packaged solution. So that can take kind and spin up a cluster with kind that's got the proper audit configuration.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. What we currently are in the process of doing, and Caleb sitting next to me, who's not on the call, is working to do, is to have basically a terraform config that it can go with any cluster, but in the way that you bring it up on kind or minikube, you have to provide the extra parameters and config file for the auditing to be enabled and for the statically defined endpoint that will be available when the cluster comes up to be defined. And then we deploy API Snoop inside of it. We've had to do that this release in order for us to write any more tests because we can't work from master. And so we're also working to get where minikube can be brought up with a build from master, because currently it only supports releases that are published, those images. And we've already got that working with kind. We're just documenting it. And so we should be pretty close to just saying, here, run these few commands on any computer to bring up kind or minikube until the cluster is up, and then run your tests, and then run this command to output your, because we have a web UI, like you just kind of, if you want to, you can browse it that way or just dump it out. Because it's a PostgreSQL database that we use org files to dynamically just define queries. We hit comma on it, and it outputs the list, which we could write, turn into, here, just run this container, and it outputs the report.
Right. So the thing would be that we'd have to make sure that we have enough enabled in that cluster, like, stateful workloads and probably load service.
It would be great if we had a, for what we want, like, I guess we just look at the kind clusters we're already running for conformance and PR blocking, or we create another one that is for.
Well, part of this is discovery around profiles too, right? So things that aren't necessarily, I don't know how those clusters are set up today or the details. So maybe we do already set up some sort of storage, persistent storage. Maybe we do set up some kind of load balancer, although I don't know how you do that with kind. Maybe we don't need that because that one at least is very clear, but other optional things, you need RBAC enabled. I bet you 99% of the vendor packaged solutions out there all require RBAC, right? So that's an argument for, some sort of solution that includes some sort of profile that includes RBAC.
Okay.
Anyway,
So,
I like that idea. I didn't want it to get lost in the discussion.
No,
I
thank
think
you for
that,
capturing that. I've been,
yeah,
to be honest, we pushed for that all the way back in the beginning to try to do, I think initially we talked about certifying vendors to where their applications only use stable APIs and getting the certified Kubernetes stable as icon.
yeah.
right.
We're not far from this. Let us do some exploration with Caleb's work.
Okay.
And what I'd love to do is put together a blog post with the underlying tooling that we have so that other people can come along and run their information. It's trying to figure out where we collect the info. And I think for now, it may be just run this, and because you don't submit it to Kate's Conformance, the repo, CNCF Kate's Conformance, it would be jump into the channel and
Yeah.
I don't
If
know.
you jump into the channel and say, hey, I want, it'd be great if these APIs could be part of Conformance so I could be confident. Now, we all know that they still can't be confident because just because you can create a pod spec doesn't mean you aren't using some bizarro feature of pod, but it's better than nothing, right?
Yeah. We get all the layers of things, and the problem that we had, not being the vendors and the tooling folks, is we didn't know how to fully exercise their tool to make it do its thing.
Sure.
We go, chart, yay, we did a chart. Okay, now what? Well, you actually have to do all of this, and trying to get, and that would help everyone with CI if we could find a way to take their product and not only deploy it, but have a standardized set of exercising all of the important things that it's supposed to do. There's room for probably hosting that stuff on.
Well, so CNCF for CNCF projects, did a big CI thing at one point, cross-cloud CI. I don't know the status of that, but this is coming from my Core DNS experience. Like, the problem with it was it literally didn't even run a single Core DNS CI test. It just like checked if the pod was running or something. Yeah, it just deployed it. And that wasn't that useful, right? And what it's, so I could see, space in CNCF to come up with some conventions that if you follow these conventions and you have, say, a repo of tests and maybe a Helm chart or whatever it is, it will deploy it to their cross-cloud CI. It'll execute those tests, and it'll produce a report, right? I mean, if projects could opt into that by following those conventions, you could, it will be very useful for the projects for sure, and it could potentially be useful for us if they're all running on Kubernetes.
Yes, I am. One of the things that I've been working on in parallel with this, and it was due to us having the CNCF Kate's Conformance repo. We've set up prow.cncf.io, and we have donations from multiple of resources from AWS and Packet, and of course Google has primarily donated their resources to the Kubernetes project. But it would be lovely to use those resources to run a Prow CNCF that we have this. Here's how you can submit a Prow job for your project to connect it in to go through this series of tests so that we have this CI that includes checking this information on what APIs are in use by the community, which can help drive development, as well as us prioritizing testing.
Yeah, I mean, if you could hand off a namespace, a kubeconfig file and a namespace, right, and just say, go to town. I mean, it all comes down to like how you make sure people don't clobber each other. Because if they're like, well, I need 17 namespaces in order for my system to work, well, but for a lot of projects, just a kubeconfig and a namespace, and they can execute and
I
some
mean,
output format.
the prowl job itself would, I mean, don't they normally limit themselves to a namespace, or we could, I know that with AWS, for example, they've got Fargate or something like that that would kind of isolate and allow for specific billing for those type of jobs. Or we, I got that's kind of on a side, Sean, as well, and getting ARM support for other projects as well. Being able to not only have builds, but also to test those builds on some ARM architecture, which we could,
Right.
I think Packet would be helpful for that. I would love any more information or thoughts on this. I'm still trying to coalesce this into something that I can present to the multiple vendors and to Priyanka. And I'll try to engage in that a little more deeply in the coming couple of weeks.
Sure.
Okay.
Thank you for noticing, John.
Yeah, sure.
We are
Okay.
at 6
I love
minutes.
that.
And I think we'll give that back. We have lots of tests that are ongoing, nothing we need feedback on right now. One thing I did note while we were looking, and it was not obvious to me initially, but at our list of ineligible endpoints, there's proxy stuff. And I remember in our last meeting, we said we are going to test that. So let's go ahead at some point and remove that as far as an action item for II, and look at iterating through those redirects as part of our deliverables for 120.
As I recall, the test was just going to be that it redirects to slash.
Yeah, that's it. It's a simple test.
Yeah, so you're going to get like 50 endpoints or something from one simple test.
Proxy endpoints are just deep. They are such low-hanging fruit for coverage.
We're going to get our numbers this quarter or this release. I'm sure. We'll do what we can, but I definitely want to see these off of the ineligible and onto test. And Stephen, I'll leave that to you to put in those PRs if that's all right. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you in a couple of weeks. Stay safe.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye.